Art has a nature to it. If it's a stream, it happens to change in only a small range of ways at the turn of each movement. A common complaint, or, if we're sweet, observation about art, is that since artists are influenced by artists, art after a while lost originality. Since something came before, there's no way to be truly grown independently. Instead, reckon that art is not that free, and that it's always been limited since art began. There are components that art toys with and needs. Creation, the way it comes to fruition, and that includes materials-wise, media-wise, means-wise. Concept, the meaning of the artwork or movement, the idea, the message, the point, the intention, the value aside from the aesthetics. Detail, aside from the meaning, the style, the depiction, the tone, the execution. It is rigidly dependent on these pillars, art is. Without all of them, what would a piece be? You can't claim fresh air and call it art without meeting at least one of the criteria. Art is definable and so follows the rules. There's no shame in it. This is out for the world to see. For something termed as relative and enigmatic, it only goes so far. Like anything else that we know, it can only go in a certain paradigm of directions, and directions bound to the components of art. If an art piece is ironic, it's only a slide away from sincere. If it's comedic, it's only shying away from dramatic. If it's commercial, it's only a bizarro version of avant-garde. Art might break down the detail or the concept, but that's all it's doing to its detailed and heavily or clearly conceptualized predecessors. Rarely is art built onto. Usually it develops through a sort of entropy or erosion model, rather than through growth or complication. Art becomes second nature as it lives on, and this always leads to new forms that simplify aspects of forms that came before. History states this is the case, as observable through art's progress from perfection of technique, from basic imagery, to the subsequent interest in breaking down the standards. Art's past. The earliest known art is cave painting. The purpose of the cave painting seemed to be religious, to manifest a good hunt by painting animals of interest, much like a rain dancing principle. Another theory would be to facilitate storytelling for tribe members, to visualize a scene for the others. Handprints were common too, which was surely something experimental. They undoubtedly are art, though, as they've design and craft in every grain of their being. If they have a purpose, based on the volume of works concerning animals, they could have been in place of photography, the same as you taking a photo of a wild turtle to show someone. Either way, cave painting shows that the people of the Stone Age had enough time off from surviving to experiment with materials in order to make imaging work. Then, theoretically, enough time to tell stories. Then enough time to create mythology and religion. In the Upper Paleolithic period, Der Lowenmensch, a statuette of a man with possibly a lion's head carved out of ivory, was created. The piece, of course, was accused of being religious, pagan. That being because of its anthropomorphic status like the Egyptian gods, it seemed linked to them. Something otherworldly, built from what was available. Otherwise, it's just a deceptively humanoid bear, in the same way medieval paintings of cats had more human faces than feline. The human gaze probably influenced Der Lowenmensch's creation, or its review. The Shigir Idol stands more firmly as religious. Predating the pyramids of Giza, it appears to be built for worship or for a totem pole type function. Pre-civilization era art is muddied by a lack of accompanying documents or reports. The Shigir Idol and other alleged religious art at least established a point to art that could be chipped away at or built upon. A complication on alleged meaningless cave paintings, or those that may have attempted to just depict surroundings. A complication on the concept. What the ancient Egyptians had was power. Political power.
Metro Boomin, make it boom.
In modern taste, the power in question would be called tyrannical. These authorities had a cult of divinity around them. Such a state would only naturally create grandiose works in detail and/or creation, simply by the levels of divinity instilling them, the potency of the concept, and its unbreakable links to society. The pillars of art are rarely independent actors. A change in one changes another, changing the scale of the work, the patterns, the intricacies, etc., showing why art isn't so free. The pyramids are considered a mystery, that there could be no way an ancient people could, with their creation capabilities, build such supermassive structures, or if they could, it'd require help from advanced extraterrestrials. Turns out the help was in the passion. Without guidelines in science and in the outcomes of previous despots, the workers could be more easily incensed to build such creations as the pyramids of Egypt. Pharaohs were considered connected to the gods, so not only status of their socio-political position, but their divinity surely flowed through all of the creation of the pyramids and through their relative speed in being constructed for the time and so on. The pharaohs were possibly so well looked after that they could see their commissions or commission gifts finished in their lifetime, an expansion on the theory around having the time to create, as seen with the cave paintings and early religion. This time everything is increased to the maximum, a lot of time in a different way, time afforded by the powers rather than accumulated through success in survival. Almost all, if not all, art in Egypt was collectively made and served a religious purpose. There was no artist in the way we know works to have. The creators of the ancient Egyptian works were more like decorators or builders, faceless, nameless, just flowing over the job and leaving their creations in the wake. There was a complication in the framework of the civilization that played a moulding role in the scale of the works, yet concepts didn't wriggle much away in the thousands of years between each other. Ancient Greek and Egyptian paintings might seem quite 2D through modern eyes. This was directly due to the lack of practice or experimentation to get accuracy right. Creation was not as precise for images and took centuries to get much better. One technique was to paint in backgrounds and details of figures into pottery, leaving the colour of the pottery itself involved. A two-colour scheme like willow patterns. However, sculptures during ancient Greek civilization were of a high class and incorporated creations still done today. Unlike imagery for a long time, Greek sculptures were proportionate and surprisingly realistic. This was possibly due to works being done with the available means of the time and the craft making sense to the sculptors. Paint application was surely not done with the paints and brushes of the late Middle Ages. Ancient Greek and Egyptian productions depicted real figures with status like Alexander the Great and Tutankhamun, along with deities. The same was visible in Christian art. Saints and biblical figures alike were depicted, set in stone. There was for the longest time a shared space for the human but larger-than-life figures, along with the extra-mundane figures of myth and divine figures of religion. The concept went largely unchanged for millennia, from pre-civilization to the modern period, remaining in the realm of depicting what was worthy to depict. From the early Christian period to the Renaissance period, creation and detail progressively complicated. The Renaissance period, when mentioned, might inspire an image of some extra Christian art, maybe the most Christian of all the movements. It would have been far too sudden for Christianity to be dropped as a concept in art, but departures, cracks were emerging in the status of the religion as a mainstay. Possibly the example would be the birth of Venus, a beginning of the re-emergence of classical mythology being depicted in the West. Seen more as cultural than religious by this stage, it would be like painting Oliver Twist or Juliet Capulet. The church and state recognised the Roman myths, etc., as shells, just figures, not as worshipped icons anymore or any threat. The Renaissance period invented techniques. The likes of sfumato was a complication in detail, adding more strokes of the brush to try and make shadows thinner like they are, and frescoes allowed for art to embed into the interiors they were painted onto. Da Vinci studied physics incredibly early for human history, with the reason being to perfect his artistic skill. He dissected cadavers to learn more about muscles, all in the name of painting movement more accurately, tendon by ligament. Looking at art from the Middle Ages and before, the people depicted were simplified, exaggerated, and unrealistic. The Renaissance was special for getting closer than before to realism in painting especially, catching up with Hellenistic sculptures. The scenes of pre-Renaissance art didn't create a sense of environment, less focus on backgrounds, merely the event, and people were understudied and looked cartoonish. The Renaissance birthed complete change, resetting art's reverence. The Baroque period took what the Renaissance offered in creation, new skills, finer detail, getting lighting right. It took the artistic elevation and it went for realism. Baroque toned down the majesty of the Renaissance, of myth, of splendour, and of biblical spectacles to show more plausible events. Caravaggio was the gateway, a master. He used lower-class people as models for religious figures, darkened biblical scenes both tonally and colour-wise. He added a realism to his work that was at times frowned upon by the church, exemplified in giving Mary dirty feet, which she likely would have had from walking barefoot. This was more of a reduction than is discussed. He was a gritty person himself, dwelling in taverns and the rougher streets. He was a criminal, a murderer. Caravaggio's skill played the role that Pharaoh's power did in getting works made despite status. For the Egyptians, technological status. It was still necessary for Caravaggio during his time to depict only mythical figures or characters, but he at least broke down who could model for these roles and therefore how they looked. It's certifiable that these could have eased the route to depicting average people during the Baroque era and later, especially in the Netherlands. The detail stayed in a state of complication throughout the post-Renaissance pre-modernist period. The focus tipped over from myth to the human level, along with the advancement of civilization. Appreciation for the common thing was found and revealed, a step down from the ruthless quality of myth and religion. Romanticism applied the monumentality of myth and religion and the visual keys to their depictions to more plausible scenes. It was the explicit bridge between religious scenes and scenes of everyday life. The movement was a-religious largely, vying on the side of individuality. Romanticism is all about making the features of a work expressive through emotional perspectives, so ideologically, concept-wise, it might be the opposite of realism, or cynicism rather. It's perpendicular to both, somewhere in each. Realism portrayed moments in everyday life, the activities of folks and their visages. The style steered from being photographically real on occasion in this movement. The Sower by Millet, for example, could be accused of being crypto-impressionist. The End of the Working Day by Breton is framed in a way that the Romanticists would have done. However, outside of detail, the realist movement was conceptually against providing scenes overly emotional and inspirational themes. It spent the above techniques on facilitating appreciation for not just average activity, but necessary work. Unromantic business, just what it takes to keep us fed and housed, nothing fabulous. You may notice that from the post-Renaissance and up to the post-Romantic period, art hadn't shifted far in its creation, detail and even concept. It stayed as an exclusive thing to only those with the ability, and it remained depicting people for the most part. Art stringently remained in the clasp of traditional, classically informed creations by the sensibilities of the times. Until the first major reduction, Impressionism. Caravaggio might have made the first reduction in this wave by using low-class models no one would associate with, and by minimising detail by darkening scenes. And realism might have been the first explicit movement to reduce concept enough to influence taste for banality. However, Impressionism was the first movement to reduce detail in such a way that it opened even the production of art to the everyday person eventually. It reduced what amount of skill was necessary to be a creator. Impressionism reduced the detail and the concept of what constituted its art the most productively up until the DADA movement. Impressionism unfocused the details of paintings, blurring them, making them rougher and less fine-tuned. The quality of loose brushstrokes embodied that. The first impression of the style was that the works were unfinished, that they were undertuned, and so they were inconsiderable. Yet the movement was the closest attempt at originality so far in art history. Impressionism was the artist's subjectivity at its most explicit yet. Impressionism was not merely an input, but a view, the view typified by the composition, landscapes, people, what's beyond the canvas, what the artist is viewing, and hence the presentation, the looseness, the undefined shapes, the nebulous scenes, is an impression of reality, a major reduction that stretched taste to include imaginatively filtered points of view into the art world and the public eye. A marriage between the subjectivity in classical art and the setting in realism that broke traditional painting. What Impressionism did, dislodging how precise a depiction could be, Expressionism did with emotion. Rather than using framing like the Romanticists, Expressionism translated emotion through unrealistic colour and shaping. Expressionism is a leap away, but deliberated on the matters of Impressionism and its branches that they've introduced and trialled. Expressionism reduced from the impression by not just showing the vision, but the state of it. What was unearthed by Expressionism was that moods are not as easily shown through real subjects and objects than through expansions on reality. Expressionism needed the subjectivity of Impressionism to introduce what could be shown on canvas for it to take that further. It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. Picasso. The kind of era of his time was dizzyingly modernist. The air of everything was iced in innovation, invention, and excellence. Anything that seemed to advance from what came before was championed by the powers that be, and that trickled into the culture outright. Vehicles and technology were designed to reflect the forward-moving ideals of the time. Buildings were built at a rate and height that felt like a contest was going on between those capable of erecting monuments. If value in the newest and most innovative creations was esteemed and applied by the powers, forward-moving art would be included. Picasso's paintings echoed off the walls built by post-impressionism, which became the standard to get noticed by the turn of the 20th century. Picasso's art qualified especially after he reduced his own detail, making it appropriate for a modern artist to stylize a figure with vastly unrealistic features, something visible in the Venus of Willendorf, an African art, showing the cycle of art. Something considered by the world as new can be something already done. Art's like a freedom. People were composed of shapes. Picasso exposed ovals could be eyes, triangles could be nose, etc. Picasso and Braque started the movement of Cubism, which was a style that was avant-garde step up from the previous movements. It incorporated geometric shapes that made up figures and objects, initially in clear 2D colour block fashion in its precursors, but eventually Cubism itself developed into 3D forms, subjects that look corrupted by breakouts of geometric shapes. Picasso's career was a major precedent to minimalism for its purposeful steps in breaking down detail, opening the doors to increasingly representative creations. Plus, clearly design started to enter in the mix of artistic expression. The most bitingly reductive movement towards concept, however, was the DADA movement. The word DADA itself is babble, wordlessness, meaninglessness, which squarely reflected off the movement's intentions to fracture what constituted as art. It seems like that was the point for a while, to some views. The Dadaists ushered in this point clearly through the creation of their work, because a grandiose Renaissance masterwork and an impressionistic painting both can be art. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and Rembrandt's self-portrait both can be. If a building and a sculpture can be, if a series of shapes and a portrait can be, if a Picasso and a Raphael can, it seems almost anything that is a creation can be. The Dadaists reduced in the hands-on quality of creating, using repurposed works, items that they signed their names on. Ready-mades they were called, the most famous being Fountain by Duchamp. Or they cut and paste photographs from magazines and newspapers to make collages, and even words from other sources to make poems. It was almost all about taking from the environment and using it, rather than just capturing it in a painting. Various Cubists and Dada derivatives followed those movements during the Modernist period. Afterwards, Surrealism went further than Expressionism did with its subjectivity, making reality not just emotionally influenced, but abnormal, trying to communicate the unconscious mind through visuals that are slipping out of reality. It did not want to split entirely from reality. After all, surreal does not mean unreal, but semi or quasi-real. More so it would be about being, at first glance, familiar, but after further inspection, every feature is distorted. Impressionism had that effect, but for its sketchiness. The forms of the subjects in Surrealism was what was off. After the Second World War, the reduction to art took its most unmistakable shape, to remove the figure or object completely with abstract expressionism. Dashes, strokes, drippings, colour fields, just full canvases of attacking colour, no formations, pure spontaneity. Where automation, the technique of painting without exertion or intention, birthed by the Surrealists, was taken to its ends by the abstract expressionists. Abstract expressionism was the first art movement that made much of a splash as the ones we mentioned that really genuinely departed from having any links to real things. Abstract expressionism was hugely remarked because of its single element of finally producing something visual that showed no resemblance to anything familiar. The first time anything visual could do what music did with sound. Picasso might have disturbed some purists by painting with childlike ability. This was when art lost many viewers by doing not just what a child could do, but an infant it looked like. If Impressionism widened the circle to include another class of skill to be accepted in the art world, and if DADA widened the circle for what class of artistic intention could be portrayed, abstract expressionism removed whatever circles were around. At this stage we get to the territory of art is a money laundering scheme, or at least the I could do that territory. Art reduced detail, crucially detail, to the point where even people thought a child could do a Picasso. Even himself. They were saying that even more grittily when they saw Full Fathom 5 by Pollock or Number 6 by Rothko. Now, another aspect to art to accompany the detail, concept and creation aspects. Intent and execution. Intent and execution are part of a web including creation and consumption. If the intent is executed in the creation, the consumption depends. Understanding the intent, measuring its execution strength, and how well it goes down overall, take part in deciding on the value of a piece for a person. A piece could be pale and malformed, but the value of the subtext could still impress a viewer despite the look. Religious works deftly pulled off depreciating the beauty of the religion's scenes of majesty, and for a religious audience, they enjoyed them. Baroque portraits were at such a skill level, the average person found them impressive. So it's understood when an abstract work is not enjoyed or found to be impressive, but also why the audience for it do consume it comfortably. The abstract expressionists still executed their intentions, and quite well even. A more effective review would be whether the abstract expressionists were inventive by depicting something unfamiliar for the first time properly, or reductive of what came before. The way goods were being produced was not like how art was being produced, where every artwork stood alone, and every artist's collection of work was a non-systemic bricolage of varied individual pieces. Andy Warhol spotted that art must be produced in a manner like factory goods, to keep up with the modern function of society, or to just break ground in art. Pop art was the movement he was associated with, putting great value into the mundane and often taken for granted everyday branded objects and goods. Creation, using print to dole out large quantities of similar images rather than painting, which was not speedy or mechanical but much more meticulous. He printed soup cans, photoshoots of celebrities and other mass-published things, even dictator Mao Zedong's likeness. He quickly produced films setting the standard form for art film.
And like I do not give a hot damn about what is the reason for all the bad I do.
To reflect assembly line art production, he made his work collectively in the factory, named aptly. But the prescient statement, "In the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes," misattributed to Andy Warhol, reflected not only the speed of mass output and the elements of celebrity in Warhol's world, but the Expressionism was also correct in spotting that desensitization towards art will affect the artist. In a system that churns out an abundance of supply, even something that isn't a product but abstract like fame will be part of the process. That even a person could be noted and used like a soup can and discarded for the next one. Remember this. Pop art reduced in concept, opting to make art nothing unlike the brands we use every day, but with the note of a sneer. The artists were beating what they considered inevitable to the jump, basically stating that art was on life support. By predicting the commodification of art, they were criticising it and stating that no one could commodify art like an artist could. As under-detailed as it was in practice, and as complacently created as it was, pop art was a complicated meta-narrative on doom, The message was its kickstand. The absolute flaw of visual art, where nothing could be reduced anymore, was with minimalism. Finally, not only was the subject removed, but even much of the colour, the only visual left. Minimalism is extreme reduction. To reduce away to the true basics makes the art insolvably figurative and almost 100% conceptual. Art had climactically left its most evident, and once seemingly necessary aesthetic components by this stage. Minimalism taught us that white-on-white paintings, cuboidal sculptures, single shapes, etc., that as little as possible can be art, contest aside. This was a continuation of DADA and abstract expressionism, and an extreme branch of Impressionism. Minimalism was like abstract expressionism. The figureless and object-free state of abstract expressionism was now blanker, taking the emotion away and replacing it with a stagnant feeling. The criticism is not the easiness of it, the lack of required talent to make it. If art's inventiveness relied on reduction, then it had climaxed on inventiveness, and early, 60 years ago. Now art had alienated the public and walled itself behind a barbed avant-garde insulation. The people transferred strongly to popular media. Artists had no obligation to offer anything for the masses when there was a strong means for that in music, film and television. Although art after minimalism did feature inventiveness, it wouldn't splash enough to reach the public eye like art used to, because for 30 years in the 20th century it was increasingly getting imperious, or at least unpragmatic. The general public have grown up decades after the flaw was hit in art's reduction and subsequent insulation, and the activity was long smeared, so current artists often go unknown, and artworks too. That's a problem that the earliness of minimalism's inception also caused. It's not the composition that's the problem, it's the exclusivity that happened to occur. Oddly, art's reach constricted when art's detail reduced, when art could be done by anybody, which is irony encapsulated. The acceleration of communications in society throughout the 20th century, but especially when it started picking up from the 40s to the 60s, the output of material and information became more rapid and widespread to the point of quickening people's lives. This is a complicated topic, but for now culture evolved with communication technologies development, which on its own went from landlines to the internet in 90 years, and a tremendous amount of influence with that, leading to changes in mindset indirectly. Shifts in the mainstream fashions and overall outlooks happened by the decade and gradually shortened. Essentialisation is also a culprit in the changes. Markets following trends would often kill them. Art generated a quality in its nature over time. Dilution. Reduction is the process, dilution is the result. Dilution mostly comes from taking the main features of a movement or genre or an important work of art and continuing with that element in mind. Later waves and generations, whether consciously or not so much, will create works that are thinner than the source of the elements. It can even happen within a series of works, movements, genres, etc. Impressionism's sketch style is a standout element, and over time art started to further and further reduce its precision and its faithfulness to reality and strength in subtext that it was eventually a sea of detail-free works. You'll see dilution in film series that are heavy with sequels, by the later instalments, in TV spin-offs, in celebrities that spawn from good timing, and in artistic movements when the personalisation falls away. Dilution is a combination of overabundant presence of an art form, passive production, and late-stage reduction. If a subgenre of music, for example, was two branches of subgenres away from the parent genre, that would be, by default, a diluted sound. It's funny how, when an artwork becomes excessively inspired, it seems uninspired somehow, and how concentration on elements dilute the overall piece. Entertainment is not free either. It is built with the same flesh and bones as visual art, as it is art. Over time, reduction has pushed entertainment art along, creating within it even. Look to classical music. Aptly it had the same place in culture and history as classical art. It complicated from medieval and traditional music by grand soundscapes with varying but complementary instruments that lorded over the rustic, story-orientated tunes. The journey from classical music to jazz, which at the turn of the century both genres charmed the cultural elite, was spotted with the value that folk and blues brought, their practicality and uncomplication. They served the average person conceptually and were learnable, with blues adding a different cultural perspective to sound and setting at hand. Jazz reduced the detail and creation of music by making music carried largely by wind instruments, and with experiments in timing owed to its more rhythmic quality than prevailing sounds. Jazz reduced the detail and creation of classical music by collaborating sounds at a smaller scale, an aspect aided by its folksier origins and genres of contemporaries. Rhythm and blues followed, condensing jazz's constitution with more pop sensibilities and added vocals. Swing may be its counterpart. It combined the innovation of rhythm in jazz and the tradition of singing and lyricism in blues, reducing from the two. Following R&B, there was rock and roll. The phenomenon, which upped the tempo from blues's BPM to create a new sound, found a wider audience. Its detail quickened the pace and further condensed rhythm to fascinate the masses, inspired by R&B's efforts to do the same. Soul followed rhythm and blues, probably influenced by the same investment into melody that the prior sounds afforded. Soul focused onto that angle of songwriting and performing, taking away the technicalities of R&B and smoothened it out into a swaying sound rather. It was maybe the first genre to concentrate on melody, as it did and stood as a major precursor for pop music. Rock and roll developed itself into rock music, again a less technical genre that preferred chord progression over scales and plucked guitar strings in its verses. The genre was like erasing the canvas a bit, loosening the constraints of specification that rock and roll required. Afterward there was heavy metal, titularly signifying the development it was from rock music. Heavy metal introduced darker themes, influenced by horror and gothic materials, using distorted guitar and more complicated percussion and louder vocals to reflect the themes, further hardening anything hard about the sound of rock. Then progressive rock introduced the complication again and took it further, composing highbrow rock that was as close to classical music as rock could go. This change pushed the frustrated to make a move, with prog rock taking the hardness out of rock, the fundamentals that made rock jumpy and defiant. Punk emerged and reduced rock down to its basis. It stripped everything down as if trying to only be identified as rock, often using only chord progressions, minimal drums, and despite decent melodies, untrained singing. Punk musicians were amateurs in comparison. See the trends yet? Soul reduced into funk music, which sped up soul into a version made for dancing. Soon after, disco was made, almost exclusively for dancing, concentrating on that aspect even more heavily than funk, and may be considered the first attempt at creating music directly for the masses to make use of, the first attempt at intentional pop music. Then synthpop laid the sonic framework out for that, finding out the electronic sounds to be the fast track to grabbing popular attention. And metal had its subgenres, with its pop form in the child of glam and shock rock, hair metal, where we see the dilution of heavy metal's concept. With hip-hop, a genre that crafted melodies usually by sampling or taking parts of pre-recorded songs and repurposing them, and generally featured spoken word or rap lyrics, the necessity of having a band was reduced away, since instruments were, and the necessity of singing too, leaning on rhythm over euphony. You might see the progression through music, how it gradually got more pop-orientated just as communications became more and more advanced. From the 80s on, recorded music was swept up into the business of entertainment of that decade. The film industry did too, the once silent visual experience that relied on expressions, framing, lighting, and costumes to illustrate tone and to clarify the story, which in turn established filmic staples. Then sound introduced more clarity with the ability to feature dialogue. This urged in the golden age of Hollywood. The golden age featured genres that utilised the remaining limitations, continuing the method from the silent era. Colour was not attainable yet, so lighting was experimented with. To match tone, shadowing techniques, inspired by German Expressionism, to convey mood and tension were implemented. When it was technically possible, films depicted increasingly realistic situations. Film became its own thing from the 50s on, leaving behind the theatrical influence on its art direction and acting, creating its own school. The 60s saw countercultural influence with pieces that tested censors being made at higher volume, challenging taboos. Culminating in the movie brats era of the 70s where a combination of fluent filmmaking, technological capabilities and imagination established the blockbuster. The blockbuster created a new culture in film. The financial success started to reach equal importance with the quality of the film. Then analysis of successful films occurred. If The Godfather did the best at the box office that year, new gangster films coming into production studios were considered. Actors that audiences and critics responded well to were likely to reappear on scene. The Western genre did extremely well, and releases were commissioned or allowed through for some decades in film. But when Heaven's Gate was a flop, and Star Wars was a major success, for example, the demand for genres would switch. Film's abilities were stretched, escapism was more easily accomplished, and the escape could reach much further distances in time and territory. Eventually, a dilution of film was observable. Where facets were concentrated on an existing production or trend, in a new production, the remaining qualities would be ignored, therefore slimming the grandeur of the trendsetter's original stature, losing its intricacies. Reduction of detail. With films produced almost entirely to financially succeed, the dilution of the art form sped up. Oversaturation of neutered productions made with the thought that they were hitting all the notes would cause audiences to define the next stroke of change. All things added up, audiences wanted satisfying entertainment per desire. Desires like those for thrills, laughs, romance. And TV wound up in the same way. Broadcasting allowed for news, talk shows, live sports, game shows, and gave TV an unorthodoxy as a result. From early enough in its life, TV didn't base itself in storylines entirely. It would still be strange for a film or theatre production to do something like a talk show or news. The activity of going to a location for something never seemed to suit such displays. TV's uncustomary status let it attempt things no one else would, and allowed for restructured presentations with series. Sitcoms were in high demand, produced consistently since the 1950s. Police procedurals, anthologies, and soap operas utilised tuning in for storytelling effect. Sitcom productions picked up by the 90s, and an introduction of adult-themed cartoons. By the 2000s, TV had something of a reality show takeover, the pop music of television. Reality shows were the human zoos finally brought about, coupling the real-person aspect that was seen on non-fiction shows, the news, talk shows, with the drama and the fellowship of fiction shows, those aspects of television as a whole. Then streaming revitalised the drama through binge-watching, taking the tuning-in aspect out and providing personal scheduling with on-demand TV. How could some of the content on TV keep up with entertainment's gravity at this stage? If you see, there seems to be a flaw that all art reaches in its development, or cynically, its entropy. It gets to a point where it can be considered printed rather than crafted. The critique here is not about the quality or the squander of art, it's about the limits. It's about the fundamentals of art and entertainment being exposed after refinement and the stagnation of production afterward, that the reduced to works are what fields of creation stick to because there is nowhere to go but horizontally. Otherwise the way to go is back to earlier movements or genres or periods. This is evident in underground and independent circles of film and music that are much influenced by unreduced or undiluted works of the past. They step over decades of reduction and repropose the aspect of the older trends. Jazz has made its comeback slightly, but the modern music recording capabilities make it sound crisper and galvanised, diluting it. Kubrickian film techniques are used in horror to try to revolutionise the long-diluted genre, but at the cost of reducing from Kubrick. This all begs the questions: where are we going next, and what can be done to avoid this nature?